An introduction to a law with a funny name. Right? Let's talk about something incredibly important that sounds like it was named by a Roman senator who's had a bit too much wine, the Posse Comitatus Act. It sounds complicated, I know. It honestly sounds like a spell from Harry Potter that would make a conga line of badgers appear. Posse Comitatus. And poof, dancing badgers. But it's not that. It's actually a US federal law, and it's one of the most fundamental rules separating our military from our domestic police forces. In simple terms, this act says that you generally cannot use the US Army, Air Force, Navy or Marines to enforce laws on American soil. They can't arrest you, they can't investigate crimes, and they can't break up your overly aggressive neighborhood barbecue. It's the legal wall that's supposed to keep soldiers from acting like cops. So what does that name even mean? Posse Comitatus is Latin for power of the county. It refers to the old-timey practice where a sheriff could round up a group of able-bodied citizens to help them chase down outlaws. Think of every Western movie you've ever seen where the sheriff yells, "I'm forming a posse." That's literally it. The law, passed way back in 1878, took that concept and essentially said, okay, sheriffs, you can deputize a posse, but that posse cannot be the United States Army. It was a deliberate move to ensure that the military, which is designed to fight foreign enemies, doesn't get turned inward to police the very people it's supposed to protect. A very specific, very important line in the sand. The core idea is simple, but its implications are massive. Imagine a world without this act. A traffic stop could be conducted by a soldier in a Humvee holding a rifle designed for a war zone. A protest could be managed not by police with riot shields, but by an infantry unit. This law exists to prevent our country from looking like a military occupation of itself. It's a safeguard against the government using its most powerful and lethal force against its own citizens for routine law enforcement. The military is trained for overwhelming force and combat, which is, to put it mildly, a slightly different skill set than what's needed to handle a noise complaint or a stolen bicycle. This isn't just some dusty old law that lawyers argue about. It directly affects the balance of power in our society. It dictates who has the authority to carry a gun and enforce laws in our towns and cities. The Posse Comitatus Act is the legal bedrock that prevents the Department of Defense from becoming the Department of Domestic Disagreements. It ensures that the tools of war are kept separate from the tools of keeping the peace at home. And while there are exceptions, and believe me, we'll get to those, the default setting is crystal clear. Soldiers fight wars, police enforce laws, and never the twain shall meet, at least not without a very, very good reason and a whole lot of paperwork. So why was this law even necessary? To understand that, we need to take a trip back in time to a particularly messy period in American history, the Reconstruction era. This was the period right after the Civil War, from 1865 to 1877. The federal government sent the US Army into the former Confederate states to enforce new laws, protect the rights of newly freed African Americans, and oversee elections. And while that sounds noble on paper, the reality was often complicated and led to a lot of resentment. Many people, particularly in the South, saw the military's presence as a heavy-handed federal occupation, not a peacekeeping mission. The use of federal troops to enforce domestic policy created immense political friction. Southern Democrats, who were regaining power, argued that it was an overreach of federal authority and a violation of states' rights. They felt the army was being used as a political tool by the ruling Republican Party to prop up Reconstruction governments they didn't support. So, when the highly disputed presidential election of 1876 happened, a deal was struck. It's known as the Compromise of 1877. In exchange for the presidency, the Republicans agreed to pull the last federal troops out of the South, effectively ending Reconstruction and with it, federal protection for African Americans. The Posse Comitatus Act was passed the very next year, in 1878, as a direct result of this backlash. It was designed to make what happened during Reconstruction a permanent impossibility. The goal was to prevent any future president from using the military to enforce domestic laws or interfere in political matters within the states. Lawmakers wanted to draw a bright, uncrossable line. The military's job was to face outward toward foreign threats, not inward toward the American people. The act was a formal declaration that the armed forces were not a national police force to be deployed at the whim of whichever political party was in power. This separation is crucial because the missions of the military and the police are fundamentally different. Police are trained to de-escalate situations, respect citizens' constitutional rights, and use the minimum force necessary. Their goal is to enforce the law while preserving life. The military, on the other hand, is trained for combat. Its objective is to defeat an enemy using overwhelming force. Applying that mindset to domestic policing is a recipe for disaster. It risks turning every interaction into a conflict, eroding public trust, and escalating situations that a civilian police force would be trained to handle peacefully. The Act is a legal acknowledgement of this critical difference. Now, you might be thinking, hold on, I've definitely seen soldiers helping out after a hurricane or something. And you'd be right, the Posse Comitatus Act is not an absolute ban. There are some very important exceptions. The most common one involves the National Guard. When the Guard is operating under the command of a state governor, they are not considered a federal force, so the Act doesn't apply. This is why you see Guard members helping with disaster relief, like after Hurricane Katrina, or managing civil disturbances, as they did during the 1992 Los Angeles riots. They are acting as a state force, not a federal one. But things get trickier when federal troops are involved. One major exception is the Insurrection Act of 1807. This much older law gives the President the authority to deploy federal troops on U.S. soil to suppress a rebellion, insurrection, or domestic violence if a state is unable or unwilling to control it. It's essentially the emergency brake glass in case of total chaos button. It has been used sparingly throughout history, for instance, by President Eisenhower to deploy the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 to enforce school desegregation against the resistance of the state governor. It's a powerful tool that directly overrides the spirit of Posse Comitatus. The line has been tested and debated many times. During the Wounded Knee incident in 1973, when Native American activists occupied a town in South Dakota, the U.S. military provided advisors, weapons, and intelligence to the federal law enforcement on the scene. This led to court challenges arguing that this indirect support violated the Posse Comitatus Act. The courts ultimately ruled that providing equipment and advice didn't count as direct enforcement, creating a significant grey area. This shows how difficult it can be to define where support ends and enforcement begins, a line that remains a point of legal contention to this day. More recently, the Act came into sharp focus during the nationwide protests in the summer of 2020. The Trump administration considered invoking the Insurrection Act to deploy active-duty military troops to quell protests in several American cities. This sparked a massive public and political debate, with even former military leaders, including the Secretary of Defense at the time, speaking out against the idea. They argued that using active-duty soldiers against American citizens exercising their right to protest would be a dangerous step, blurring the lines that the Posse Comitatus Act was created to protect. The troops were ultimately not deployed in that capacity, but the debate itself highlighted the Act's fragile but essential role. So why should you, a person living in the glorious year of 2025, still care about a law passed shortly after people stopped riding horses everywhere? Because the principle at its heart is more relevant than ever. In an age of increasing political polarization and social unrest, the temptation for leaders to use every tool at their disposal, including the military, to maintain order is very real. The Posse Comitatus Act serves as a critical check on that power. It's a constant reminder that in a democracy, the military serves the nation, but it doesn't rule it. It prevents the normalization of seeing soldiers on our streets as a solution to domestic problems. The Act also protects the military itself. The institution's effectiveness relies on the trust and support of the American people. If the military were regularly used to police its own citizens, that trust would evaporate almost overnight. Soldiers sign up to defend the country from foreign adversaries, not to get into confrontations with their neighbours, friends and family members during protests or riots. Forcing them into that role would be devastating for morale and would politicise the armed forces in a way that could damage their integrity and non-partisan status for generations. The Act, therefore, isn't just protecting citizens from the military, it's also protecting the military from itself. Furthermore, the ongoing debate around the militarisation of the police makes the Posse Comitatus Act even more significant. As local police departments acquire military-grade equipment, like armoured vehicles and assault rifles, the visual line between a police officer and a soldier has already started to blur. The Act stands as the last major legal barrier, reminding us that no matter how much gear they have, a police officer is still a civilian accountable to local laws and communities, while a soldier operates under a completely different system of rules designed for war. It forces us to confront the question, what kind of society do we want to live in? One where peace is kept by community officers, or one where it's enforced by soldiers? In conclusion, the Posse Comitatus Act is far more than a historical curiosity with a weird Latin name. It is a cornerstone of American civil liberties. It is the legal guardrail that keeps the world's most powerful military from being used as a domestic police force. While it has exceptions and has been challenged, its core principle, that soldiers shouldn't police citizens, remains a vital safeguard for our democracy. It forces a deliberate and public debate before the government can take the extraordinary step of turning its armed forces inward. And in a world that feels increasingly on edge, having that guardrail is not just important, it's absolutely essential.